What is back? Welcome up. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we are going to be focusing on today just how good throughput is and just how good companies overall are in terms of price equilibriums. This will be an advanced tutorial, so if you have any children present, please ask them to leave. Please hide the children, preferably someplace high where the other children can't reach them, because what we will be doing is we will primarily be consulting the spreadsheet. And so we will be looking at things from the perspective of price equilibrium. So what we will be doing is we will be briefly talking about, okay, what do you mean by price equilibrium? What is this? But we've done this in previous videos. It's a bit of a long and extended discussion, so we're going to have a heavily abbreviated version here. Then we will be talking about just how good throughput is, because you have throughput as a component of a company. And then we will be talking about how good is a company as it relates to affecting equilibrium price, which is kind of a good way to look at just how good a PM is when you are having the advantage of both the construction and the throughput bonuses that you receive from a company. And then we'll be talking about how this affects overall strategies, as well as discussing a little bit how the relational nature of economies is such that you can have a circumstance where in order to make another company better or more efficient, it would be better to get a company that's not even in the same industry. But we'll talk about that more later, and let's get into it. In the description below, I will post a link to a video where there's more of an extended discussion on price equilibriums, but we will briefly explain it right now, which is that for every building, you have a bunch of PMs, and the PMs will have an output and an input, and if you subtract the input from the output, you will get a net value added. If you further divide it by something you care about, like efficiency per 100 workers or efficiency per construction, you can get one of these values here. So, for example, we see sawmills. It has an efficiency per week of construction of 100 because the net value added is 100, and the efficiency is based on a per week basis when you have 20 units of construction per week, which is what we put here in terms of the construction cost. And so from this, we know that it will have an efficiency per week of construction of 100. If you, in theory, change the output price or the amount of goods that are output, so if we just come in here and we just do that, it will have less efficiency per construction. The efficiency will go down. What a price equilibrium is a situation where you are indifferent to what you build based on the price of the things, of the goods. All of these goods in this section of the spreadsheet are calculated based on base price. So when we say a PM is really good, we're saying that it's really good if the good is at base price. But if wood were, for example, at a half price, minus 50%, then the output value would only be 600, and it would be only efficiency per week of construction of 40. So the efficiency per week of construction would go down, and we would go from, let's say, preferring to build wood to preferring to build something like lead on atmospheric engine pump when this occurs, because there's more efficiency per week of construction because wood is at minus 50%. From this, we can actually construct or come up with a theoretical economy where we are actually completely indifferent as to what we build. So we have here equilibrium efficiency for this column in our theoretical economy that doesn't exist. In this theoretical economy, for the sake of simplification, we are only going to pretend that there are 5 goods. From this, we can determine what the price is going to be needed in order for their equilibrium efficiency to all approximately be equal. And that is what this here represents. We are calculating based on per week of construction. This is what we care about for this equilibrium. And you can see here, all of these are roughly 57. They're a little over 57. And in order to get the equilibrium efficiency of 57 on iron on condensing engine pump, we will need to have a price of minus 5%. However, this is taking into account the fact that all the other goods will be different in price, because you need to do this because if, for example, if tools are at plus 10% or plus 12% in this case, that's going to make the PM for iron less efficient, right? Because it uses tools as an input good. So that's going to increase the input good price. Similarly, if coal is more expensive, this will also increase the input good price. So for example, if tools and coal are on plus 30%, we could come over to the industrial goods here and look at steel tools in this column, and if both of our inputs are 30% more expensive, or let's just simplify it and say that they're 25% more expensive, then we have an efficiency per week of construction right now of 53. If we swapped the input values to instead cost 2,000, we will see that the efficiency will go down per week of construction. And so the input goods matter, and with this equilibrium thing, it takes into account all the price changes of both the inputs and also the outputs. So the output is minus 5% on iron here, and the inputs, because there's 15 of each, will be an average of the price of both tools and coal, which we see is 2% and 12%, and so the average of this will be 7%. So if we were to come over to the Resources tab and go down to the iron mines, we would be able to, for atmospheric engine pump, plug in, a minus 5% output price and a plus 7% input price, and we would actually get the exact same efficiency per construction that we have here over in the equilibrium table, which is going to be 57 here. Okay, so that doesn't look quite right. Oh, because it's on condensing engine pump. Yeah, so we would get 57 instead of 67. And so what we have done is, even taking into account all the changes of input price, these prices here will give us, roughly speaking, the same price for every single one of these 5 industries that are all interrelated. They're relational. So if I just randomly come in here and I up the price of tools, for example, to 50 instead of 44.8, you will see the efficiency of iron go down because the inputs have been made more expensive. It was 44.8, right? Can't ruin my equilibrium because it's based on guess and check. So this is what we have here. And what the significance of this is that from a purely economic perspective, not taking into account a whole bunch of things that are going to matter, like, for example, how quickly you're depeasanting pops and raising SOL and this sort of thing. From a purely economic perspective, when we're talking about the efficiency of the building, we actually now don't care what we build. We're completely indifferent at these price equilibriums as to what we build. It's also important to emphasize that this is relational. This isn't like an absolute price level. All of these prices could be higher or could be lower, and they could still be in an equilibrium where the equilibrium efficiency, instead of being 57, is 62 or like 45 or whatever it is you want it to be. And so we will be having, we do not care which of these buildings we build, which is very significant point, because now we can, because we know we don't care, we can take a look at the price, and from the prices determine which industries are generally best to overbuild. And when I say overbuild, it means that we are willing to tolerate a lower price while still having that be the building that we want to build. So for example, we see that wood, if we care about efficiency per construction, we absolutely want to blast the wood, and we are really, really not caring even if the price becomes depressed, because it is so efficient per construction at creating value. You could get down to a minus 34% price while you have blister steel. To be fair, blister steel is wildly inefficient. While you have blister steel at plus 46%, and you can look at this, you can jump into game, right? And you could look at the prices of stuff, and you could come into your market, and you could have steel at plus 46% and wood at minus 30%, and it's still better to build the wood. And so when we think about things through this perspective, we say that an industry is really, really good if we have a very high tolerance to overbuilding it, such that we collapse the price. And so that's the main idea behind equilibriums here, is that we are effectively solving for how good something is in relation to everything else within the economy. Because the economics of Victoria 3 are relational, it's important to do this in a relational way, which this section of the spreadsheet doesn't take into consideration because it's considering everything from base prices. Of course, we're not solving for the entire economy, because every time you change any PM, it would have a ripple effect. So for example, if we got the better tools PM and we decrease the equilibrium price on tools, it will have a ripple effect on the rest of the equilibrium efficiencies of everything else in the economy. And so that's why we are looking at it from this very, very limited scope of just having and looking at 5 industries. that was a bit longer than I wanted to spend talking about throughput, but I think it's really important to understand why the target prices or the prices changing is so important, and also to understand that these are interrelated, and it is not merely if I make iron more efficient, right, I also will make steel more efficient without even touching the steel equilibrium price. And so I think that that's important to understand. But let's talk about throughput now, because throughput is a very, very strong thing in Victoria 3. It allows you to effectively get an extra percentage of a building. So here we have 182 buildings, but we effectively have 70% more of a building. And the way throughput works is it will increase your inputs and it will increase your outputs by that exact percentage, and it will not increase the labor costs. So for things that have a ton of labor costs, like in a relative proportion of kind of the price of operating the building, something like universities, throughput is extremely strong. If we take a look at this university, we see that roughly 80%, a little over 80% of the cost is actually in the wages. And so when we increase the paper cost and then we increase the innovation, qualifications, and urbanization, that's real good. Urbanization might not scale with throughput, I forget. But I think it doesn't. But pushing really high throughput is valuable, but it's going to affect how good a PM is, because if we have a net value of 1,000 on a PM like we did on the wood, and then we increase the inputs and the outputs by 50%, then what will happen is then the net will increase by 50%. And so if we have like this scenario where we have net value added and we increase it by 50%, it's going to make the thing way better. And this would not change equilibriums at all if we could get the same level of throughput on all these buildings. But that is not really the case. What is the case is that usually some things are easier to get throughput on than others. And so here we have a scenario which we're calling our high throughput scenario. And we have a bunch of other tabs to look at. And in this scenario, we're assuming a throughput of 35% on iron. The reason we are not assuming a max level throughput on iron is because not every iron will have 51 potentials. You can build tools as high as you want, you can build steel as high as you want, you can maximize the throughput on those, but you can't do it on iron, and man oh man, you really can't do it on wood. In fact, this 15% is generous, and we have it on 35% on the iron. I think it's worth mentioning how the math works in terms of the value of the buildings you build when you build an additional building, when you are gaining throughput from economies of scale. So we're going to delete a building here, and so the throughput will go down to 9%. When we build this 11th building, it will actually be worth 120% of a building, even though we're getting a 10% throughput. And the reason for this is we will be getting the initial 110% throughput from the building, or 110% of a building effectively in terms of the PM. We will be getting this on the 11th building itself, but we will also bring all of the previous 10 buildings up from 9% throughput to 10% throughput when we complete this additional marginal building. And so it's effectively worth 120% of a building before we consider any other sort of throughput modifiers that we're getting from trade unionist bonus or company bonuses. There can be quite a lot, but if we were to come in here and let's say look at tools, you'll see that we'll have a really high throughput bonus even when we don't have a lot. But okay, when we build our 51st building, it will be worth 200% of a building, because we are getting the 50%, the extra 50% on the building itself, the 51st building, because it's getting 150% of inputs and outputs. And then also, we will be moving the previous 50 buildings up from 49% throughput to 50% throughput, and so it's effectively worth 51, or it's effectively worth 200% of a building on the 51st one. This is why, as a late game play pattern, pardon the lag, as a late game play pattern, often you play a little bit of a whack-a-mole with anything that is under 51, because getting something from especially the mid to high 30s to level 51 is going to be more valuable than building on top of the 51st building. This is why we have a bunch of level 51 buildings exactly, because what we can do is each building that we build on top of this Montana one, for example, the 33rd building is going to be worth 164% of a building. So why would we build a building that's going to be worth 150% of the building? Because it's not increasing the throughput of any of the previous buildings anymore when we build the 52nd building, when we could build something that's worth 164% of a building. And so this is an important thing to understand in terms of how throughput works. The math, of course, is going to break down when you are also considering throughput from other sources, because this effect of wanting to 51 buildings is going to be less important the more throughput you have from other sources. Also, the less throughput you have, kind of the more valuable a throughput modifier is. If we already have, 40% from this, it's going to be less valuable for us to get 50% from economies of scale if we're already getting this 40%, because moving from 100% to 150%, you are increasing your output by 50%. If you go from 150% to 200%, you're actually only increasing your output by 33% because you're increasing it of a third of where you were at before. So the marginal increase of throughput is less valuable the more modifiers you have of it. And so we're not trying to min-max throughput in terms of our discussion here, or talk about all the sources of throughput, but I think that this is kind of a worthwhile discussion regarding throughput so that we understand it. Okay, so hopefully that discussion adds a little bit of context and also some practical applications regarding throughput or building throughput for economies of scale, and also helping to understand that when you're in a position when the trade unionists, for example, become powerful, giving you another manufacturing modifier, that the effects you see from giving steel and tools a bigger throughput than you're giving iron are going to be replicated, or they're going to be increased by virtue of you're going to have more throughput on manufacturing industries, especially into the late game. And this is one of the reasons the late game, industries scale so well. It's why wood, while being a really good industry, if we come back in here, we have a whole bunch of places where they're not even employed. And the reason is, well, they're not very efficient per worker, but also we can't really get high throughput. We have a throughput of 9 here. Whereas if we come to this same building and we click on something like glass, there's a throughput of 70%. And we cannot increase the throughput any longer on the logging camps. So I think that this is worth mentioning. So coming back into here, I would like to direct your attention to these are the values that you have with no throughput bonuses. So this is without considering throughput, the net value added, the construction efficiency, and also the worker efficiency. To the right of these we have the net when you consider throughput, which I think is worth thinking of and looking at. And what we will see is that there is a 15% increase, for example, on the wood here, but the increase is going to be greater on the iron. And you will see kind of a rearranging of what is most efficient in regards to both construction and worker efficiency. As a result of this pulling through. And you will also see a commensurate or similar change in the prices relative to the prices we have on the far left. Now we will have to scroll over, but minus 5% is the equilibrium here for for the iron, minus 25%, and then 2%. If we scroll to the left, we will see that it was minus 34%, so wood was significantly better, or we are willing to overbuild it to tolerate a much, much lower price when we don't consider the throughput. The minus 5% is the same, and then we have a 2% versus a 2%. So the other two didn't change at all. The mines didn't change at all, but also we have a 12% equilibrium price on tools and a 46% equilibrium price on steel here. And when you consider throughput, instead the prices will be 40% and 8%. Important to emphasize, blister steel is really a terrible PM. So it's not the case that you want to just let your steel always kind of be this expensive, but in the early game especially, having expensive steel is A-okay. But this effect, you will notice, is changing the equilibrium of values that we're shooting for, in particular really, really hurting the value of wood. This effect will not really be in place in the early game, because in the early game, you're not building for throughput that hard, you're building for MAPI, which is going to be a separate video, throughput versus MAPI, but in the early game, wood is just absolutely incredible, but it falls off not only because it's not very worker efficient, because if you take a look, the worker efficiency of wood is the second lowest out of all the ones here before you consider throughput, but after you consider throughput, it's almost the same as steel. It's not just because it's less worker efficient, but it also, you're going to have a really, really hard time chasing any sort of throughput bonus unless, you know, you have Tver, or for example, this is the like state in the game that has the absolute most wood. Where is it? Right here. It has the most wood potential at 40. So you're going to cap out at 39, but you're also not going to get stuff, you know, like the trade unionist bonus, which is going to give you up to plus 20% manufacturing industries throughput. This, of course, brings us to companies, because with companies, you can gain a throughput bonus as well. And it's important to emphasize, yet again, this throughput bonus is going to be most valuable, obviously, on industries that are just good in general and you end up building a lot of. For example, we have 1,800 steel mines. The fact that it's applying to 1,800 steel mines is going to be more useful than, let's say, 180 arms industries, because we have 1/10 the number of industries. Even though arms industries are better, we just have more steel, so it'd be better to have steel on throughput on a steel company. But also, it's going to be more valuable on things that you don't already have throughput on because of how the math works. If we get a 20% throughput bonus on something from which we already have 100% throughput, which to my knowledge, this isn't going to be something you could do that easily, but if you, I don't think it's actually possible at all. But if that were the case, we would only be increasing our output by 10% relative to before we slot in the company. If we do it on something where there's zero throughput, it will be increasing it by 20%. So that makes things that are going to have really low throughput naturally, like railways, which have zero naturally, really strong. And it's also going to be strong on stuff like wood, iron, coal, and steel, because one of the reasons that we start suffering, if we come back into the browser, one of the reasons we start suffering as a result of having this lower throughput value on all these other industries, if we had an iron company, we wouldn't have lower throughput here, would we? If instead we consider ourselves to have a throughput bonus, it caps out at 20%. Here we are considering ourselves to have a throughput bonus of 17%, which I think is on average kind of what you're going to have in a game, because you won't always be the number one power. If we consider having iron here as a company, then suddenly iron is not really negatively affected in the way it was before, and actually we can tolerate an incredibly low iron price. This is a huge movement in iron price that we are willing to tolerate. But also, I think that it's really important to note, look, as the iron price comes down here, the steel becomes much more efficient as well. And we are willing to tolerate a much higher price for the steel before we want to actually build the steel, because we're thinking of things in terms of the equilibrium, right? This is the price level of all these related to each other at which we're indifferent to what we build. And so we can tolerate a much lower price with the iron when we are putting in a company and getting a 17% throughput bonus. And so this is really, really significant, and it's also going to be a much larger effect. I actually didn't format this as well as I should have, where I could just change the throughput bonus and it would change the numbers, but it would be a much larger effect on the wood, because we would be getting a 115% bonus, we would be getting an additional 20% on top of our 15%, which is more valuable than 20% on top of our 35%. Right here, let's do the math for that real quick. Okay, so here to the right, we do have kind of a little bit of a table for when you increase the net by 20%, how valuable is it? Or when you increase throughput by 20%, when your current throughput is a number, how valuable is that 20% increase? If you have no throughput, it's a 20% increase in your net. If you have 100% throughput, it's going to be a 10% increase in your net. And we can see that if we, let's say, had wood at 10% and also have, let's say, the iron at 30%, it would be worth an 18% increase in our net. versus a 15% increase in our net. So, coming back to, the equilibrium sheet, there is a certain throughput value, and this is the point we wanted to make earlier. There's a certain throughput value where it will actually be more valuable to, say, get input a company for iron in terms of decreasing the equilibrium price on steel, because we are decreasing the inputs, and remember, everything relates. In the high throughput scenario, coming back up here, it was kind of where we were. In the high throughput scenario, when we added the iron company, we saw that there's a sharp decrease in price, a 7% decrease in price on the steel in terms of maintaining the same equilibrium, because it has 60 input on iron, and we've decreased the amount of iron. And there's also, for companies, a decreasing marginal return. If you have multiple companies for the same industry, you will get a decreasing amount. Now, there is an equation for it, and it doesn't spit out exact numbers here, so we can't do it precisely. On two of them, though, you will get a 30% bonus if you have two. It just doesn't work in a linear way. But you see that we have two iron companies here, right? We have the generic iron company, and then also we have Carnegie Steel. And so if we go and we find an iron place, we will be able to see what our throughput is, and we are getting 30% from the company. So the first company was worth 20%. The marginal one from two competing companies is only giving us an additional 10%. But even if we were trying to maximize the efficiency of a particular industry, and let's say that industry is steel, it can theoretically be the case that we actually would be better served decreasing the price of the inputs in order to decrease the equilibrium price as much as possible, let's say on the steel. So it might be the case that an additional iron company, especially when iron doesn't have a lot of throughput because of how the math works, right? In terms of when you have something with less throughput, it's more valuable to gain throughput. It can, in theory, be the case that slapping on companies for inputs is going to be valuable, but also this is why one of the reasons why companies in particular, even if it's really, really so valuable to put companies down on the resources, because the resources, first of all, have the best PMs in general. In general, the mines are going to have spectacular PMs, but the mines also serve as inputs for stuff like the industrial goods. And so if we can continue to pull down the price of, the iron, it's going to allow us to have a lower steel price, which is going to allow us to, with steel's maybe not a good example, but in the case of something like tools, if we pull down the steel price slightly because we have a lot of iron and we spam the iron, and we pull down the equilibrium on this, and then we pull down the equilibrium further on tools by having a tooling company as well, or even a steel company as well. If we hit multiple links in the chain, then we can get a very, very cheap steel price or tools price, for example, which makes it easy for us, as a matter of strategically speaking, to do stuff like dump tools into our, other countries' economies. If you have vertically integrated companies, as we do here in the USA, we have the companies here. We have a tool company, we have two iron companies, and we have a steel company. These are the major inputs that we have for the thing. And so in this way, this is how, if you wanted to spam export tools, I think it would be better to go about it this way overall than it would be to just put in 3 tooling companies. We have each link of the chain, because if we take a look at the tools require mostly steel, and they also require coal, but that's because we're using labor-saving PMs. And so then we come in, the steel requires mostly iron, and we can hit lower equilibriums, and the lower equilibriums will have a cascading effect because we're making the PMs more efficient, and so it can allow you to do stuff like dump goods if you have a larger chain. Similarly, if we were playing as the EIC, for example, which EIC no more, and we were wanting to spam clothing industries, it might make sense for us to have multiple companies, not just a clothing industry company, but also a company that would be giving us cotton or dyes or silk or something like this, if we're thinking of companies from a vertical integration perspective, because the equilibriums are going to be relational. Okay, so now let's focus in on the second benefit of a company, right? Which is that they give you construction efficiency. The construction cost of the iron is actually only going to be 308 because we are getting extra efficiency. Now, efficiency, just like throughput, you're probably going to have some things that are giving you construction efficiency modifiers, and it won't just be what you get off of the company. Like if we come in here, you can see 35% construction bonus, and so it's maybe not the best indicator, but we do have it here with 35% construction efficiency. It will cost 308 construction, which if you take a look here, the efficiency per construction on the iron is much better than it is up here. It's in fact like 25% better. This is absolutely huge, and it's particularly important in the early game that you can spam out really hard whatever industry you happen to be focusing on. You see efficiency per week of construction. Here, nothing holds a candle to wood, right? When you take into account the company, iron actually beats out wood here. Because it's only costing 50% more construction than the wood, and it has more than 50% higher net throughput or net value when you consider the throughput bonus that we have on here. And so this is going to mean it's really hard to overemphasize how valuable decreasing the construction cost of a thing is. If we, for example, decrease the construction cost of this by 35% by bringing it down to 130, I'm pretty sure we have this formatted correctly. Look at this. Absolutely monstrous construction efficiency on the wood. For a lot of countries, if you have a sizable amount of wood that you can utilize, you can just absolutely blast it to the stratosphere, put it in a wood company, and then max it out to depeasant really quick. And this is kind of beyond the scope of this video, because we're just trying to isolate the equilibrium price. So the consideration of depeasanting is much less of a consideration, even though it's a consideration in game. But mathematically speaking, when we look at construction efficiency, the construction bonuses are disgusting, and they also stack. They don't stack, they stack in the same sort of diminishing returns way that the throughput bonuses do, so it's going to be like multiplied by 1.5 the first time. But if you can stack multiple companies just for the purposes of spamming out, when what you care about is construction, then it'll be really valuable. The construction bonus, obviously, when you are starting to not care as much about efficiency per construction and you're starting to care about efficiency per worker, then the construction bonus doesn't do anything for you. Then it's entirely based on the throughput bonus. Let's take a little bit of a look here when we are considering the throughput or when we are considering efficiency per 100 worker. Alright, so when we look at the values per 100 worker for this economy, you'll notice they're going to be wildly different. Just kind of briefly brushing over it, wood gets way worse. In fact, you expect to see a wood price that's actually kind of high, and this is actually why all of our wood's unemployed in the USA game that we are looking at, and you see a much lower equilibrium for steel. The reason, of course, for this is that the equilibrium net on all of these is it doesn't matter what we if we're caring about workers, we're only caring about efficiency per worker. The equilibrium net per building is going to be you're going to want them all to be equal, whereas here you notice the ratio here, the wood is half the equilibrium net on the equilibrium point than it is condensing engine pump, but that's because we're dividing, right? We are dividing by the construction cost. And so as the construction cost increases, then it's going to make a situation where you're going to need to be twice as efficient in order to hit the same equilibrium. When we're caring about workers, when we're caring about per 100 worker, equilibrium nets will all be the same because you're not dividing by the construction cost, you're dividing by the number of labor. To be fair, they're not all exactly the same because each of these buildings actually does have a different amount of labor, but you'll notice the manufacturers tend to do a lot better in general, the tool and the steel, and these are the exact same industries that are going to do a lot better once we enter the late game as a result of adding in the throughput considerations. So let's take a look at the values when we think of the throughput. So we could see here worker efficiency before we consider the throughput bonuses, and then when we add in the throughput bonuses, right, in terms of efficiency per worker, we see tools is disgusting relative to everything else. Next up will be iron, And then coal. Coal has slightly worse PM than iron, but it's also relational, right? And then we see next up is actually going to be wood, slightly more efficient, and then this, and we will see kind of a commensurate price activity here, which is that we are expecting to see a really, really high wood price. Keeping in mind, even though this is more efficient per worker at base prices, which is what we're looking at here, when we take into account all the inputs required for stuff, then we will see that we will have a lower equilibrium price for steel, which means we would want to build more of it than wood. And the reason for this is our really, really efficient industry per 100 worker, right, is going to be the tools, which is going to drive up effectively the demand for steel such that we can support an equilibriums like this. But if we look at equilibrium efficiency, which is dividing by the number of laborers, we do see, in fact, that steel will actually have a lower equilibrium price than wood. And this is the type of situation that you get often in kind of the late game, where your wood industries kind of collapse. Now, I think there's a secondary use for the wood industries in that it creates available employment for the purposes of migration, so I still think spamming wood is great. But when you enter sort of the mid-game transition, when you are starting to care about efficiency per 100 worker, and also you're reaching the later points of the game where you're also going to be getting throughput applied from, the trade unionists, in those particular situations, you'll see prices that start to look more like this. Also, keeping in mind, these are early game PMs, condensing engine pumps, softwood, steel tools, blister steel. There's a tool upgrade. There's a really nice steel upgrades relative to these things. And the wood upgrade is also not that good, so this is why you see a lot of wood stuff not employed. But taking a look down here, what happens when we add the company? And so let's talk about it. So we're caring about value per 100 worker, and we've added this iron company. And you can see the price for iron has come down in terms of the equilibrium, which means that we will want to build more of it because we will tolerate a lower price before we are indifferent, before we reach equilibrium as to what we build. You'll see this go down, but also, again, you'll see the steel go down. But there's something I really want to emphasize here, which is that you also are getting to see the effect of construction being disgustingly valuable. Here, this is a more modest sort of decrease in the price equilibrium. We went down minus 6% here, right? But here, we went down minus 16%. And that is the double effect of both the construction and the throughput. And so I think that this difference is really important to emphasize here, is that when you are in particular depeasanting, when you are caring about having a high value per construction, companies are way, way, way more disgustingly strong than when you are caring about a high efficiency per 100 worker. But also, in theory, not so much in practice because of Mappy and because the AI is not very good, but we might see a difference in 1.7. We'll talk about that in a bit. In theory, you could just stack a bunch of stuff on one industry, a bunch of throughput modifiers, and then focus on that one industry as you enter the late game, and you would just get increasingly efficient on that one thing. It's a bit interesting to think about, but I think early on you would just want to be as ravenous as possible, spamming the companies that are going to be resource focused. And even if you are spamming ones that are resource focused, I think that one of the important takeaways here is going to be that, of course, if I increase my iron in the early game, that's actually going to make it easier for me to export tools because of the relational effect of the price equilibrium if I'm building the most efficient building every time. But yeah, this is a much smaller effect when we add the company, when we are starting to care about per 100 workers, because we are not decreasing the price of the construction. Much, much more modest. Okay, before we wrap things up, I did want to talk about 1.7, because for me, the company's strategy is going to change a little bit in 1.7, and I think it's going to change in a bit of an interesting way. As far as I understand it, whatever companies are had locally in a state are going to be the companies that assign the throughput bonus. What I do not know yet is how will the construction bonus apply if you are building in someone else's country. I don't know how this is going to work yet. If it's the case that you are going to still get your construction bonus when building in someone else's country, it's going to be super, super just flagrantly, obviously broken to spam companies that relate to resources, but not only resources, but it will actually make all the agricultural industries, in my opinion, a lot better, because I think that you will generally want to build in agriculture in other people's countries for a few reasons, one of which is it seems like, as far as I understand it, so one of the reasons that we can't show this off very well because we went Council Republic, but under a normal circumstance, under normal ownership, let's say privately owned, the aristocrats actually split ownership with the farmers, and so they don't get full investment. What I think 1.7 is going to do specifically is I think it's going to take away all the ownership that the farmers get in the building, and maybe this is not the case, maybe they'll still get the ownership, which means that if the aristocrat full owns the building, then you'll actually be getting way more investment pool on agricultural buildings than before. You don't want to build these in your own country, but what you can do is you can just blast them on other people's countries. And so it might be the case, if the company bonus is applying to other people's country, in particular for rice, it might be the case that rice companies are really, really good. Because rice is disgustingly OP per construction, it's not very good on a per worker basis, but if they're not your workers, who cares? And so it might be the case that you just want to slot in a rice company and just spam rice all over China, and which will cause massive unemployment for them, but that's not your problem, or only if they're using the tooling thing. And then you just import from them, right? You just import as much grain as you want from them, and then because they have a company, or because they have so much rice that's being built, and they have a lot of unemployment, it's going to really depress rice prices, and so you will ensure that rice doesn't get built in your country, although even with your throughput bonus. But the secondary thing is, in terms of deciding what to build in other people's countries, we're probably going to start using a little piece of the tab that we don't use currently right now, which is going to be actually checking what companies other countries have, because if you know that they have a throughput bonus in a particular industry, then it makes a lot of sense to slot in the corresponding industries. I really wish the corresponding industry showed, because it doesn't here. If I recall correctly, this is like furniture and glass. This is, I don't know what this company is, and this is going to be like the rye. But if we see that Russia has like a company that gives rye, we might just want to spam them in there, knowing and understanding that they are going to be getting a throughput bonus there. And so it's going to be more efficient, and in this way, even if it's not more construction efficient for us, we're looking at the other end of the thing. So the first end is maybe you slot in the rice companies so you could just spam rice in other people's country, because we care about the construction bonus. But if we care about the throughput bonus, then we're starting to scout out, okay, what companies do people have slotted in? So for example here, we would want to spam wood in their country because they know they get the throughput. Although I kind of think slotting in a wood company and spamming it all over the place is going to be good, especially like coming in and spamming it in places like Tver, because Tver, as a state, has a 20% logging industry throughput bonus, and so like if you just spam out all of these, they will have like a 59% throughput bonus before any sort of companies are considered from both their economies of scale as well as the throughput bonus. But this is maybe a little bit of a digression, but I think that the strategy will kind of change. But I think understanding the underlying thing is useful for thinking through this. And also, if generic construction bonus is going to be a lot better than company construction bonus, if you use your construction bonus when building other people's countries, or sorry, if you. No, it's not going to be useful, because I think the generic construction bonus is only going to apply when you're building in your own country. I think the company bonus might apply when you're building in other people's countries. And so, for example, it might be the case that us building a bunch of iron when we have two of the companies slotted in other people's countries is going to be ridiculously strong. And it might be the case that we don't even want to build it in our own country. This is like a weird thing to think about, just so we can secure everyone else's iron in terms of it being owned in our country. And only then do we build it ourselves. This is going to be another thing, is the resource industries in general are just the best. And so the idea that you want to full extract all resources from someone else's country as part of your strategy, and you just apply all the companies and you just spam them in their countries, that's maybe going to be a thing. In which case, you would have to, the resource industries, in which case, you would have to build manufacturing back home and then import the resources, which leads to very strange things to kind of think through. But this is just kind of speculation on the back of, what we've been covering, or what we have covered today, which has been looking through a bunch of equilibrium conditions. We didn't look through every equilibrium condition that we have here. We didn't look at company when we have labor-saving PMs, I guess we're going to look through it just kind of briefly now. You can see that when we use the labor-saving PMs, we can tolerate an even lower price on stuff like tools, which is, by the way, this is why when you saw kind of our USA example, the Hyper Lake game, it's easy to understand why we have a really, really cheap tool price, and that's okay. And also, if we look at the USA stuff, and we look at the trade routes, just very briefly here, I'm pretty sure our most disgusting trade routes are tool ones, or our biggest trade routes. Yeah, we're just exporting tons of tools. We're just dumping it to the other people's market, which allows us to build more tools, which are incredibly efficient. I guess it's not that many tools. We don't have a lot of trade routes because it's called lag. Anyways, I think that as far as a summary goes, I don't think we can summarize necessarily like the entire shtick of this. But a very short summary, I suppose, would be something to the effect of throughput is important, and it's going to change equilibrium prices in a sense, and it's also going to be not applied evenly, and the fact that there's an asymmetry in what's giving throughput is going to make manufacturing industries better than they would otherwise look. Because manufacturing industries you can tend to get a higher throughput on, and so when you're evaluating something from this abstracted spreadsheet perspective where we're just looking at the PM itself, it fails to take into account not only throughput but also equilibriums, and when you put it all together, you will see situations where decreasing the price of iron, or putting in an iron company, actually decreases the equilibrium price of steel, but also it's going to be very, very strong from the construction bonus as well. And you can really, really super overbuild, and by overbuild I mean build until you hit this point where you're indifferent as to what you build next, at a much lower price. You can tolerate a much lower price for things you have companies for when you have a lot of labor, because the combination of both getting the construction bonus and the throughput bonus just ends up being disgusting. Like, this 16% jump is huge, from a minus 5% price with no company in terms of the equilibrium to a minus 21% price in a same kind of with the same kind of other prices. The other prices are roughly speaking the same, except for the steel, which of course dropped down a ton. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I apologize there are so many cuts. I'm kind of tired, so I think I flubbed and needed to cut this video up quite a bit more than the normal video. Yeah, if you liked, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good one.